Welcome back. For our next exercise, we are going to configure firewall policy rules for our Azure firewall. This will be our network rule, our DNAT rule, and our application rule. However, before we do that, we're going to eventually need to test our Azure firewall on a virtual machine. So let us go ahead to provision that virtual machine. I'm going to go to our home page. I'm going to click on More Services, and I'm going to click on Compute. Over here, I'm going to select virtual machines. For virtual machines, I'm going to hit a create to provision a new virtual machine. We're going to select our resource group. And then for our virtual machine name, I'm going to provide a name in here. And then I'm going to leave our region as East. I'm going to leave our availability option as an availability zone. And then next, I'm going to ensure that we are only provisioning in one zone. I'm okay with our operating system image as a Windows server. I'm going to leave our size this way as well, and I'm going to go ahead and provide user credentials for the admin. I'm going to go ahead to turn off our public inbound ports, and then I'm going to go down to our next tab, which is the networking tab. Over here, I'm going to ensure that I'm selecting the virtual network that we deployed our Azure firewall and firewall policy within. As we can see over here, there are a few options for our virtual network, so we have the right one selected. The next, I'm going to ensure that our default backend subnet is selected in association with this virtual network. I'm going to select this one. The next, I'm going to look at our public IP. You may choose to leave this on, but for this exercise, we are choosing to put this off because we are looking at our virtual machine as a very secured and private virtual machine that also has a firewall implemented for it. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this off by selecting none. For our network security group, I'm going to go ahead and configure an advanced network security group. Over here, I'm going to ensure that I select the create new so that I can update our naming convention. I'm also going to ensure that we have an RDP configured already, and so we see that has been added by default to help us connect remotely. So I'm going to click OK. Now, do remember again that most times when you turn off your public IP address, it means connecting via RDP will be hard because RDP basic connection does need a public IP to connect remotely via a remote desktop connection. However, in this case, because we've turned this off for our public IP, we're going to deploy a virtual machines Azure Bastion once this virtual machine has been deployed. Now that we have everything in play over here, I'm just going to select this, and then now we can jump into our tags. So I'm going to select tags over here and put in some tags. I'm going to attach this to a team and then the project. And now we are ready to deploy this provisioned virtual machine. Now, remember again, this is going to be the virtual machine we're going to be using to test our Azure firewall and its policies once everything is in place. So let's go ahead to deploy that. Now, this deployment, of course, will take just a few minutes. So I'll be back once our deployment has been successfully completed for the provision virtual machine. Welcome back. Now that our virtual machine is successfully deployed, let us go and quickly deploy Azure Bastion on our virtual machine before we proceed with configuring our rule collections for our Azure Firewall policy. So I'm going to click on Bastion over here, and I'm going to deploy a Bastion. So while that is busy deploying, let us head over to our home page, and then let us go and configure our Azure Firewall policy rules. To do that, I'm going to click on Resource Group, and then I'm going to select our resource group of choice. And then from here, I'm going to select our firewall policy. So now that we are in here, the very first firewall rule policy collection we're going to configure is our DNAT rule. Once we are done with our DNAT, we're going to create a network rule as well as an application rule. So let's go and configure our DNAT rule. Over here, I'm going to click on Add Rule Collection. So let's go ahead to fill in these details for our rule collection for DNAT. So over here, I'm going to provide a name here. I'm going to say DNAT rule 1. And then for our rule collection type, we're going to leave that as DNAT. Do remember that as you're looking at all these 3 different rule collections, we can see that for DNAT is applicable to this. The application is also applicable to application. Network rules is applicable to network. So be sure to always make sure that the right rule collection is selected. In this case, because this is a DNAT rule, we are selecting DNAT. Over here, we can set a priority value between 100 to 65,000. I'm going to provide a priority number of 200. And then next, we can see our rule collection action is being set for us already. And then I'm going to look at our rule collection group. The rule collection group should match with the type of rule you are creating. In this case, we are creating a DNAT rule, and I can see this is for the DNAT rule collection group. If we look at other types, you can see the one for the network, which is this. We can see the one for the application rule collection, which is this. Since we are creating a DNAT rule, we select the DNAT rule collection group. For this over here, I'm going to type in RDP NATs, because this is connecting our RDP connection by associating our Azure Firewall's public IP with our virtual machine's private IP address, which we will see while we are configuring these levels of roles. And so for the source type, I'm going to select IP address. For the source, we're going to use an asterisk. So I'm going to go over here and put in an asterisk. For our protocol, we're going to be selecting TCP, since this is a TCP connection, and association for our virtual machine's private IP in collaboration with the Azure Firewall. So I'm going to select TCP. For our destination port, since we want to connect via RDP and ensure that the route has an association with our virtual machine, we're going to say 3389, which is the port for our RDP connection. For our destination, it tells us this destination should be an Azure Firewall IP address. And so you're going to use the public IP address for your Azure Firewall, which I showed us when we provisioned and deployed our Azure Firewall alongside our virtual network. So when you retrieve your public IP address for your Azure Firewall, you can put it in here. So I've pasted that in there. Next, for the translated type, I'm going to leave that as IP address too, because we're going to provide an IP here. Now, for the translated address, or the IP address we're going to be using over here is our virtual machine's private IP address. This IP address can be retrieved from your virtual machine's landing page or overview page. If you scroll down a bit, you will see it. It can also be retrieved under the network settings left menu navigation of your virtual machine. Once you click on the network settings and the page loads up, you'll be able to see your private IP address for your virtual machine. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in. That is 10.0.2.4. And then for the translated port, that has to match also our destination port, because it is translating our public IP address of our Azure Firewall into the virtual machine's private IP. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in 3839. That is for our RDP. So now we have all our settings in place. I'm going to go ahead to click Add. Now, this will typically take some few minutes, so we will be back once this rule collection has been successfully deployed. Welcome back. Now that our DNAT rule has been successfully deployed, we can see all of the details in here under the DNAT rule. Now, the next thing we're going to provision is going to be our network rule. So let's go ahead and select network rule. And then over here as well, I'm going to say add a rule collection. So for our rule collection name, I'm going to put in our net rule 1. And then again, for the rule collection type, we're going to leave that as network, since we are provisioning or configuring a network rule. For the priority as well, so I'm going to put in 200. For our rule collection, we want to add an allow to allow our DNS configurations. And so I'm going to go next to our rule collection group. Because this is a network rule, when I click this drop down, we're going to select default network rule collection group. Over here, I'm going to say allow DNS for the name. The source type will be left as IP address. For our source in here, we're going to provide our IP address range for our subnet. This is because our network rule is trying to associate our virtual machine's subnet with our custom DNS servers. And so to do that, I'm going to put in over here 10.0.2.0/24, which is the IP address range for our subnet that is the back-end default subnet for our virtual network, as well as the subnet associated with our virtual machine. And so with that in place, I'm going to go for the protocol and I'm going to select UDP over here. Next, for our destination port, we're going to be using destination port 53. We're going to leave the destination type as IP address. And then for our destination, we are going to provide our custom DNS servers, which are public DNS servers that are utilized and provided by CenturyLink. And so I'm going to paste that detail in here. And so as you can see, it is 2 custom DNS public servers. And it starts with 209.244.03 separated by a comma, then another 209.244 just like this. However, in this case, the next one is 0.4, whereas the first one is 0.3. And they are both easily separated by a comma. And so with all of these settings in place, I'm going to go ahead to click Add. And now our network rule is being deployed. So we're going to give this a few minutes and I'll be back once our network rule has been successfully deployed. Welcome back. Now that our network rule has been successfully deployed, we can see the details for our network rule that was configured and is listed and provided over here as a role. Now for our next task, we are going to go and configure an application rule for our firewall policy. To do that, again, I'm going to click on Add a Rule Collection. I'm going to provide a rule name here. And then we're going to leave the rule collection type as application. For the priority, we're going to put in 200. We're going to make sure the rule collection is an allow because we're going to provide a website that we want to be allowed on our Azure Firewall. And so the target here is that eventually, once we log in remotely into our virtual machine via Bastion, when I go on our internet, our Azure Firewall should allow a specific type of website that can be listed as rows in here. For this case, we're going to be testing google.com. And so when we log in remotely into our virtual machine via Bastion, the only websites we should be able to access are websites that are allowed under these categories. And so let's go ahead to put in the other details. For our rule collection group, I'm going to drop that down. And because this is an application rule, I'm going to select default application rule collection group. Over here, I'm going to say, because we're doing an allow for this particular rule, I'm going to say allow Google sites. And then over here, we're going to leave the source type as an IP address. And then we're going to connect the source here as our subnet. This is the subnet associated with our firewall's virtual network. So I'm going to go in and put that details, 10.0.2.0/24. And then we've provided that. And so that is the source and the source IP address range. And so for the next is the protocol. Over here, because this is a website we're going to include in here, we want to be validating this for the HTTP and HTTPS protocol. Do bear in mind there are other types of protocols you might want to put in, such as a protocol for a database. However, for this case, since this is a website, I'm going to put in HTTP and then space HTTPS. And so we are knowing and confirming that when we check the website, it is also validating both for an HTTP and an HTTPS. This is going to be a TLS inspection. We're going to leave the destination type as an FQDN because we are testing this against a website whose domain will be represented as a FQDN. So over here, I'm going to put in www.google.com. And so, based on this configuration over here, the only website we should be able to access, which is based on our allow, should be google.com. So once we log in, we're going to perform those tests. For now, all our configuration looks great and good over here. So I'm going to go ahead to click the add. Now, this typically would also take some few minutes, so I will be back once this rule collection for our application rule has been successfully deployed. Welcome back. Now that our application rule for our firewall policy is now successfully deployed, I can see the details provided to me over here. The destination is google.com. The source IP range is targeted towards our backend subnet for our virtual network where our Azure firewall was deployed on, and it allows the protocol of 80 and 443, which is for our HTTP and HTTPS connections. Now for our next task, we are going to quickly go to our virtual machine. I'm going to go to our resource group, and we're going to go and update our custom DNS servers. That is, we're going to go to the network interface of our virtual machine to go and update the DNS servers to be custom, and we're going to provide those CenturyLink public IP DNS servers to be the custom servers. So let us go ahead to do that. And do note that that is not totally a full requirement, but for testing purposes, we want to ensure that those are in place. So under our virtual machine, I'm going to go to our network settings, and then I can easily access our network interface that is associated with this virtual machine. So let me go ahead and select that. Now within our network interface, I'm going to select our DNS servers that we just mentioned. And so you can see over here, we're going to update this to a custom. And then for this custom DNS servers, we're going to pass in those CenturyLink custom default public IP DNS servers. So I'm going to go ahead and select custom. And then I'm going to provide those two DNS servers. One of them is the primary and one of them is the secondary. So I'm going to provide the primary, and then the secondary is only differentiated by the number 4. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that again, and then I'm going to update that to 4. And so now we are using a network interface DNS server that is a custom type with our public DNS servers from CenturyLink. I'm going to go ahead and click save over here. And as you can see, that is saving and updating the network interface. And so we can see that has been successfully updated. And so now that we have our DNS server in place, the next thing we need to do is to restart our virtual machine so that this custom DNS servers can take place and be recognized fully by our virtual machine. To do that, we are simply going to navigate back to our virtual machine. I'm going to use the navigation mapping over here to select our virtual machine. Now that we are back, I'm going to select the overview, and then I'm going to say restart. And it's going to ask me, do you want to restart? I'm going to say yes. And so we'll see that the virtual machine is being restarted. Now this is just going to take a few seconds or minutes, so we're just going to give it some time to successfully update that. And then once the virtual machine has been successfully restarted, we are going to go to our next module or exercise where we are going to go and perform testing of our Azure Firewall. Welcome back. Now that our virtual machine has been successfully restarted, as we see over there, we can now be sure that we are ready for our testing phase. In our next module, we're going to go ahead with testing our Azure Firewall.